Yeah, well, with this site, my grandfather bought this property in 1921 because he grew up just down the hill, and he started clearing the land. And one of the first things he did was actually to plant some vines, and he wanted to plant Grenache. Now, the first Grenache was actually planted in Clarendon in about 1850, and so I think when there's from that particular vineyard, there was a few small vineyards sort of were planted around Clarendon. So if he bought this place in 1921, he would have sourced some cuttings in 1921, put them into a bed, and in 1922 he then planted out the first 1 hectare site. So back then it wasn't a situation, oh, this is a great place to grow grapes. So having said that, when you just go across the Onkaparinga River where the first vineyard was planted, there was already a blueprint that yes, this area probably does grow good fruit. And the thing about Grenache was you planted it out as a bush vine. It did well as a bush vine. Now back then no one irrigated anyway, but if you get around now, everyone irrigates, but you don't Grenache, so you don't irrigate Grenache. So it was a lot of labour back in the 1920s, 1930s. That's what you did a lot. And there was what were there, horses would have been used to cultivate and stuff like that?
That's all we used, horses. We used to have 4 draft horses that did all the cultivating and all the work and whatever. And then when tractors started to come in, my dad said, no, not going to have a bloody tractor. Horses will do okay. But then eventually we had apple trees down over the hill here, and we got a neighbour or near neighbour to come over with his tractor to do a bit of cultivating, because the tractor got stuck, didn't it? So we had to use the horses to pull the tractor out. So that stopped my dad from thinking about buying a tractor for another few years. But anyway, eventually we started off with Bessie Ferguson. We ended up with about 3 of them. But no, it did take me a while for my dad to get around to buying a tractor. Horses would do the job. Because we had our other place over where we still live. Sometimes we'd have to bring the horses over here. And I used to ride the horses from home over here. And we had one horse that was a bit jumpy, and one day I was coming, don't matter which way I was, I forget now, and 2 big trucks passed us. First truck was okay, but the second truck was put the bloody horse off, and away we took. And we bolted down the road. It only took us about half the time to get home that day.
Yeah, because when Dad talked about the other property, because my grandfather planted that one in he bought that in 1930. Yeah. So he had this property. Now it took until 1945 where he actually then started planting Grenache over there, and ended up planting 60 acres, that's about 25 hectares. So we only had, where we started out here, we ended up with 25 hectares of Grenache. So as the crow flies, it's about 4k over there. So this was sort of that block over there, which is really the start of our journey, if I can call it that, with Grenache. Because then in 1946-47 started planting there, then we planted here again in the 1950s. And Dad and I planted another block in 1999. And of course, the property over there is now part of Yangara, so all their old Grenache, Dad, my uncle, and my father planted it. So we've had a fair connection with Grenache in this, especially around this particular part of McLaren Vale. There's a couple of things, because it is quite loamy and it's a bit ferrous. You find, especially when you go through and cultivate, occasionally you'll bring up a bit of ironstone. So you actually see the ironstone in the soil. Now the outlook is southerly, but it is at 230 metres above sea level, which means it's one in the higher part of McLaren Vale, which means we get a later ripening, we get a slower ripening. So we get pretty good tannin development, and also the acid holds up in the wine. And I think that actually shows through in the final product of the wine. So you find that Grenache made from this particular area is very different to your Blue at Spring Sands or your Seaview heavy soils, and a lot of that has got to do, I think, with the microclimate up here that we have of those cooler, longer ripening positions. And yeah, you put our Grenache up against a Blue at Springs and or a Seaview, or going down towards the McLaren Flat, McLaren Vale, you find it's a very different. It is a very different wine, and especially even with the Angara, which is 3-4 k's away. Well, all the old vines over there came from cuttings out of that block we planted in my grandfather planted it. They had nearly got close to planting it in 1999. Sorry, 2022. So it's totally the same clone, but the wine is very different. Lower down sand compared to what we have here.
I can't believe my father, how he bought all these properties and what have you. And he was only 20 years old when he would have bought this one, and he was only 21 years old when he did plant the first lot of vines.
Yeah.
So that's how we know it was planted in 1922, because that's when he would have been 21. So yeah. But when I was 20, I don't think I would have been out buying properties and planting vineyards. But I got a bit. I did help plant. I've helped plant every vineyard that we've got here, except those over there, of course. They were planted in 1920, even that's before my time. But I've helped plant the rest.
Well, it's winemakers discovering the resource and working out how to make a really good wine out of it. You saw even back in the 90s, some people had a go at making Grenache, and it was just...
But at least it proved that you local winemakers didn't want Grenache, but the Italians and Greeks did. Yeah, so they knew which was the best wine, which were the best grapes. Yeah.
Because they had a style, they knew what style they wanted to make, which suited them. But yeah, no, especially with Grenache, the resource has always been here. But I think it also, back in the 50s and 60s, Grenache was used for fortifieds. It was actually all made into port. So you had that 60s, suddenly that market diminished, and you had Grenache there and people didn't know what to do with it. So they put into a blend. Like you may know Darry Osborne, he was a great supporter in the 70s and 80s of Grenache because it would go into, well, back then they called it Burgundy, but you don't call it Burgundy now because you don't. But so for about 20 years, probably 20, 25, 30 years, it was just seen as a blending wine. So no one actually really thought about what can we do with this. So suddenly it came, I think in the 90s, you started to see people start to look at it, especially in the last 10, 15 years. There's a few winemakers that said, well, hang on, let's see what we can do with this. And it's a matter of treating it properly, because I think, and I'm not a winemaker, it is a little bit more difficult to make a good Grenache than a Shiraz. I think with the Shiraz you put it in there and away you go. And also, especially with Grenache, it depends on whether you want the oak treatment or whether you don't want any oak in it. So you can tweak it a little bit more than with your Shiraz or perhaps even Cabernets. And that's what probably, there was no knowledge of that with Grenache until they started to take it seriously.